Welcome everyone to our first cybersecurity speaker for this school year. It took us a little bit to get this one off the ground. We were a little busy this year in the world of cybersecurity, but I am thrilled that Mr. Nate Fick, class of '95, is generous enough with his time to come back and speak to our community. Mr. Fick and I were talking a couple minutes before we started and talking about some of the classes he had in this space as a student. So Loyola has changed a little bit since he was a student here. But it really hasn't. So we still are focused in the world of Jesuit education. We still have a very clear mission. We've just added some things to it. And one of the things we've added in the past 3 years has been that of cyber science and cybersecurity. So I'm thrilled to see some parents here today as well. Hopefully you'll get some insight on kind of what we're up to and hear what happens, no offense to the people in the room, including myself, happens in the real world of cyber and in the world of business. So with that, Mr. Fick, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks. Welcome back.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's always a real pleasure to be back. And I'll just tell you at the outset, this is not going to be an hour-long monologue for me. So I thought maybe I'd just share a little bit of my experience and turn this into a conversation. I'm sure that given what you guys are doing and the results that you've been racking up in some of these competitions, you know more than I do about a whole bunch of aspects of this space. So I could share a little bit of the business leader standpoint. I work a lot with our customers in the government and out of the government. And so anything's fair game. So feel free to ask me anything that's interesting to you. And I'll do my best to be transparent. Just a little bit about my background after leaving Loyola. I graduated from here in '95. I went to Dartmouth. I was a liberal arts major, so not an engineer, not a computer science major. Out of Dartmouth, I went into the Marines and was an infantry officer in the Marines. So not a signals intel guy. Again, not a communications person in the Marines, but a knuckle-dragging grunt. 5 years in the Marines. And then I got out of the Corps and I went to business school. What I liked in the military was building and leading my teams. And I wanted to find a way to do that for the rest of my life without being in the military forever. And so business school was a translator for me. It kind of gave me the vocabulary and some of the network to keep doing the things that I enjoyed in uniform, out of uniform. I also did a public policy degree because I was interested in international relations and national security stuff. And in business school, I got to know a professor who was also a partner at a venture capital firm. And I joined the firm when I graduated as an operating partner. So essentially as one of the guys in the venture firm who was making investments in early stage technology companies and then helping the management teams run them and scale with them. And operating partners for venture firms or private equity firms are like a little stable of people who can then go in and help run the companies at various points in their lives. So about 4 years into that, I had the opportunity then to go run one of the companies we'd invested in called Endgame. And Endgame's a cybersecurity company that when I took over almost 3 years ago now was working almost exclusively with the government and almost exclusively within the government with intelligence community and government customers. And I've heard a little bit about what you guys are doing on the network defense side, so let me talk about the evolution of what we did really from the offense side, moving into the defensive side. And I think there's been a steady drumbeat of high profile things happening in the cyber world for the last few years, right? And from my perspective, there's some big macro trends that are unfolding, that are shaping how this whole landscape evolves. One of them is a convergence between what's happening in the government, or between governments, and what's happening with companies. So the quaint old world of companies spying on companies and countries spying on or attacking countries is obsolete. So we live in a world now where the Iranian government or Iranian-sponsored hacking groups are attacking American banks, and where the United States, the American president is vowing retaliation against North Korea for their alleged involvement in a hack on an American movie studio, right? So the lines between government and commerce are muddy here. It's not, it's not like tanks on tanks or just old style corporate espionage. It's all mixed up. So the first macro trend is that convergence between federal and commercial. Another trend, I would argue, is a narrowing of the gap between offense and defense. So the old paradigm was American football. It was 11 guys on the field playing offense, and you pull them and you put 11 guys on the field to play defense. And the new paradigm, I think, is much more dynamic. It's much more fluid. The bright red line between O and D is a little bit blurrier than it used to be. It's more akin, I would say, to European football. It's whether you're playing offense or defense really depends. It's soccer. It depends on what direction on the field the ball is traveling. So that's another thing that is shaping how people, at least in my part of the cyber world, are thinking about what's happening. And the whole space, in my view, is characterized by 4 vectors, if you will. They're all traveling in the same direction, basically, but at different speeds. The fastest vector is technology, and the tech's unfolding very, very, very quickly, right? Because there are huge advances in computing power, huge advances in manufacturing, massive financial incentives. So there's a lot of stuff that's propelling the technology vector very quickly. And social norms are the second vector, and they're unfolding right behind the technology. So think about how you guys relate to technology relative to your parents, maybe even relative to older siblings. Our social norms change and they evolve right behind the technology. So that's the second vector. Then there's a huge gap back to policy, government policy. And then even behind policy is the law. And the law is the slowest moving of all the vectors. And I would say that all the interesting stuff in cyber is happening in the gap between what's technically feasible and socially acceptable, right? That vector, pair of vectors, and then what's defined from a policy and legal standpoint. All the interesting things are happening in that gray area in between. And that's where the risk is, it's where the opportunity is. So let me just say a word about kind of our business and how I see the cyber world. We're still a small company. We're about 150 people, but we hire 1 person every week, so we're growing fast. And for the parents in the room who are maybe wondering why your sons are spending time on this, I would just say I just came from a meeting with our head of recruiting, and we get 200 or 300 or 400 applications for every finance and business development and corporate development kind of job. But hiring our engineers is more like, it's like sniping them. We have to identify them almost by name in other companies, and then we have to go try to get them. And they're exceedingly expensive, and we have to court them very carefully. It's a seller's market. So if you're inclined to pursue this and develop these skills, you can be assured that at least for a while to come, the unemployment rate in this field is just about 0. It's a wickedly competitive space. As a matter of fact, we've had to open offices in a bunch of different cities just so we can compete for talent in a bunch of different talent markets. So we're in DC. We are outside Fort Meade in Maryland. We're in San Francisco. We're in San Antonio, Texas, where there's a big cybersecurity kind of center of gravity. And then we're down near Cape Canaveral on the Space Coast of Florida. So we've got a good footprint to draw on these different talent pools, and I think that's what we'll need to maintain our growth. So what we're doing is, again, Endgame started in the offensive space, working for the government. And as these different macro forces that I was talking about have unfolded over the last few years, I would argue that the only way to build an effective defense is to have a good understanding of the attacker's mindset. And when I was in the Marines, we used to say that before any operation, anything we were planning, pause for a second and turn the map around, which meant for us, don't only limit ourselves to thinking about how we're going to go do something, right? Recognize that it's a game of chess. You're up against a thinking adversary, and a smart enterprise of any kind, a smart company, a smart security team, will turn the map around and think about what they look like from the adversary's perspective. What do you look like from the attacker's perspective? And I think there are a few things that are common to most companies right now from an attacker's perspective. And we have guys on our team who are literally the best at the NSA and CIA and other places. And now we're trying to take those skills and repurpose them for enterprise defense. And so they can go into a company and say, here are the 10 things that are leaving you very vulnerable. And if I were to just generalize a few of them, one of them is enterprises, companies, security teams, operations teams don't have, I won't overplay. It's not that they don't have any understanding. They have a far from perfect understanding of what's actually on their networks. So think about the trends of the last few years. These things are game changers, right? Mobile devices, all of your employees bringing mobile devices to work, they're all connecting to your network, and they're just very hard to track. The cloud migration, the fact that just from a business competitiveness standpoint, you have to rely on cloud services. You have to rely on infrastructure as a service. And that makes you responsible for things you don't control, because now you have all of these HR and CRM solutions that are out there in somebody else's cloud, but they have your data in them. So, that's a huge challenge. The general trend of connecting things to the internet, right? More and more devices are becoming IP enabled, and so it's not just the laptops and the desktops and the mobile devices in your company. It's the automobiles and the household appliances and the thermostats, right? It's the Fitbits, for God's sake. I mean, it's everything. And that trend is only continuing. So, I think you guys probably know, what was the vector into Target for the Target breach? HVAC system, right? So come in through the heating and air conditioning and jump to the point of sale. So the point is only that most enterprises have no real understanding of what's connected to what. So that's point number one, if you're turning the map around and looking at it from an attacker's perspective. Point number two is, and that's about you. Point number one is about visibility into yourself. Point number two is most enterprises don't have visibility into their adversary. So most defensive systems are still set up to defend against generic malware. So botnets, brute force attacks, whatever, sort of the stuff that's become the background noise of the internet. And there are companies out there now that are adopting taglines like, you don't have a malware problem, you have an adversary problem. So you can almost ignore a lot of that background noise and think about what your crown jewels are. What are the most important things you have? Whether it's your, if you're a drug company, maybe it's some of your formulas. If you're a defense contractor, it's the blueprints for your new fighter jet. If you're a bank, it's your customer data, and on and on and on. What are your crown jewels, and who would want them? So, and then putting forth a really focused defense to protect the most important stuff from the people who most want it, not all of this generic background noise. So security products are deployed today and they throw off thousands and thousands of alerts and they overwhelm security teams. And so you have plenty of examples at Neiman Marcus or Target or many of these recent breaches where the products worked. They threw the alerts, the teams were just drowning in the noise. So all these products that were supposed to parse signal from noise there's so much signal now that it's become noise. Another thing that you see if you turn the map around and look at it from an attacker's perspective is most defenses are pretty passive. And passivity doesn't work against an active adversary. So I would argue that we have to become more active or proactive in hunting on our own networks. So the term active defense has been a euphemism for offense. And I'm not an advocate of offense in the commercial world. I think it's a bad idea for two reasons, at least, right? It's a bad idea first because it's illegal. You're not allowed to go into other people's networks without permission. Now the asterisk on that comment is that laws change. It used to be illegal to drink alcohol in this country, no matter how old you were. Child labor used to be legal. So laws change, and there are an awful lot of people in financial services, for instance, big banks and other places who are really upset at this point, saying, okay, the government's not helping us and we're not allowed to help ourselves. What are we supposed to do? So the laws might change, but for now they haven't, so don't break them. The second reason, though, why it's not wise, in my view, for companies to go on the offense is because a lesson I learned in the Marines was don't escalate unless you can dominate. So don't work your way up the fist, stick, knife, gun ladder unless you can go all the way. And I don't care if you're one of the biggest companies in America. If you're a Fortune 50 company, you're not going to win against North Korea, Russia, or China. So don't even try. It's just not smart. So what does active mean in that context? I think it means hunting on your own network. It means adopting an offensive mindset and doing it only on permissive networks where you have permission. And only by doing that, I think, can we reduce the average time from breach to detection from its current, anybody know what it is, enterprise-wide right now? It's about 200 days. So the lag time from breach, kind of average, forensically, from breach to detection and remediation is 200 days. Think about all the terrible stuff that happens in those 200 days. Think about, the number of times your credit card has been stolen because of that lag time. It's a bunch. So adopting an attacker's mindset means being active on your own network, not passive. And then the fourth and final thing, if you turn that map around again, think about it from an attacker's perspective. IT and security teams are right now, generally, they're compliance focused, they're cost centers in the business, they're peripheral to the core business. The CEO tends to say, hey, just, I delegate that to somebody else, go do it, be the dog that didn't bark, I don't want to hear about any problems. And that doesn't win against the disciplined attacker. So, one of my guys likes to say, it's always been more fun to be a pirate than join the Navy, right? And so talent tends to gravitate to the pirate side of things. And we need to do all we can to encourage talent to also gravitate to the Navy side of things, which is getting IT and security teams where they ought to be, which is much closer to being a core business function. Because ask Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, right? Or ask the Target CEO who was fired by his board because of this breach, if cybersecurity should have been on the agenda in the C-suite at those companies. And I think everybody at this point, most people now would say yes, but it's a change that we need to make. So I guess in summary, I'm also happy to talk to whatever extent you want about running a technology company as a non-technologist, which is a unique credibility challenge. And I think that it might be something that many of you end up grappling with, and something I predict you'll reach back to is your experience at Loyola, because we have a lot of great engineers, and many of them are wonderful people. All right, here comes the punchline, right? So, that's not enough. You can have great technical leaders, but running a business, growing a business, and succeeding in a market, and actually selling stuff, and building a company takes a little bit broader skill set. So think about it as a team. No individual can do it alone. You got to put a bunch of different pieces together, and I'm guessing that for many of you, that's a path that you're perhaps going to be on within maybe a shorter time than even you think. Could be single-digit years ahead of you. So with that, listen, that's a little bit of a survey of kind of how I see the cyber world today, but I'm happy to take this any direction you want to go. Sir?
I have a question. I'm real curious. There's a big debate in education today. I read your book, by the way, one more away a while ago, and you went to Dartmouth, you had a liberal arts background, you find yourself now working in technology. I kind of in the same place, but people are screaming for really technical skills at the same time. I mean, what's your advice to these guys as they're, trying to make their way through the educational process the next few years, go to college, figure out which sort of happens?
Yeah. Listen. We're all prisoners of our own experience, right? So I can talk to you about the things I did that I benefited from. The bottom line for me is it's adaptability, flexibility, not rigidity. We're not able to pick winners with any kind of fidelity. We can't sit here and predict what the most in-demand skill sets are going to be 20 years from now. I don't think. So rather than try to pick winners and risk being wrong, I would say try to build a set of experiences for yourselves that's going to allow you to be flexible and adaptable and resilient and change paths and scale. I've got a pet theory that it takes about 10,000 hours to get good at something. There's a reason why law firms encourage their young associates to bill 2,500 hours a year. And if you kind of multiply that by 4, it's 10,000. So that's 4 years. College is 4 years, high school is 4 years, a presidential term is 4 years, an average military enlistment's 4 years, an average Gen Xer changes jobs every 3.8 years. There's something about 4 years. There's something about 10,000 hours. And so, I see people like my friends and colleagues who are now, 20 years post high school. We've had a few iterations now of a 4-year chunk, and people generally fall into one of two categories. You got the people who built their 10,000 hours, and then they built 20, 30, 40, 50,000 hours in the same thing, which is great. And that is definitely a path to success. I've been a little more schizophrenic. I built 10,000, and then went over here and built another 10,000 from the ground up, and then went over here and built another 10,000 from the ground up. And so my wife might say it's not the recommended course, but I feel like building basic competence in a bunch of different things is good for resilience, and it gives you flexibility. So, that's not a specific answer to your question. I can't say you should study engineering and then go get an MBA. Yeah, okay, right now, sitting where I'm sitting, that sounds like a pretty good combination, and I don't have a high degree of confidence that 20 years from now that's still going to be true. Yeah.
Do you think the future of cybersecurity is going to move more towards government responses or towards private corporate responses?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, and really not an easy one to answer. I think the question was, will cybersecurity responses move more toward government responses or more toward commercial responses? I think it's going to be both, and I'll try to explain why. First of all, governments are going to have to do more. They're just going to have to, because, again, we have a legal system right now that actually precludes the companies from doing a lot themselves, and yet the government, for various good reasons, isn't doing it. So, if governments believe that IP and personal information are important in a democratic society, that the IP is part of the engine of our economy, that personal data, there's a reasonable right to expect privacy over personal data. If we're going to keep the internet as a trusted domain for commerce and communication, governments are going to have to do more. But at the same time, I just think it's wishful thinking for us to think that the government can actually move fast enough to do what we need to do in this domain. It just can't. So let's not put it in a position to fail. And so companies are going to have to do more too. The security industry, in my view, has suffered from basically a systemic failure. We've spent billions and billions of dollars and trained hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, and yet it doesn't feel right now like we're winning. So companies are going to have to do more too. And maybe most importantly, there's going to have to be better collaboration between the two. Right now they're adversarial. I have an office in Silicon Valley, and even inside our company, the people in the Silicon Valley office don't understand why we have anybody in DC, and the people in DC don't understand why we have anybody in Silicon Valley. From my seat, we need both. So I try to keep them from tearing one another apart. And I think that's actually a microcosm of a broader issue here. So government and technology are going to have to play better together. And one of the simple things government can do is encouraging information sharing, de-risking information sharing, somehow lessening liability for things that happen as a result of information sharing. There are a bunch of things that can probably be done that are relatively low-hanging fruit. Yes.
How do security companies protect things like the certain software you sell?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different kind of flavors of security companies. If we're talking about information security, the basic breakdown is between product companies and services companies. So product companies build software. You walk into one of our offices and it's a factory. It's a manufacturing floor. We don't build hardware though. We don't build boxes. We build software. But it's a bunch of people at open desks sitting or standing at computer terminals with headphones on. And they don't like to turn on the lights, and they would prefer not to be near the window. So there are software companies that are writing code. There are hardware companies that are building boxes that you plug into your, you plug into your network. And then on the other side of the divide, you have services companies, and they're doing things like responding to incidents or doing forensics to understand what happened. Like if something happens on your network and you call Ghostbusters, I mean, literally, there's like a van full of people that drives up and they hop out and they figure out what happened. The Geek Squad. Yeah, exactly. There's, kind of one of the best Geek Squad companies was a company called Mandiant that was just bought by a big public security company a big public security product company called FireEye just bought this services company called Mandiant to try to put the two together to offer both products and services. So those are the basic distinctions though. Products and services, and within products, you have hardware products or software products. And there's no silver bullet. Most effective network defense requires some combination of these things. A layered approach, if you will. So a good characteristic, I think, of an effective defense is a layered approach. A lot of different things. So that if an attacker gets through one, they have to deal with another. You kill the dragon, and then the monsters come, and you kill the monsters, and then something else comes. So it makes it harder and harder to get to the goal.
Yes. What made you want to move Endgame into the enterprise side of the market?
Yeah, what made me want to move Endgame into the enterprise side of the market? A bunch of things. So first, I had investors flogging me in the back to move us to bigger and bigger markets. So going after big markets is better than going after small markets. Going after fast-moving markets is better than going after slow-moving markets, like the government. So there was that kind of business imperative to go into bigger markets. But actually, I believe firmly and tell our team all the time, I don't think we can do what we need to do in the government market if we don't also build enterprise products, because we need to attract the kind of talent. We need to attract full stack web app developers and build a technical kind of a dev and tech ops capability and a customer support capability and all these things that isn't really in the DNA of federal companies. So I was really fortunate that the DNA at Endgame from the beginning was commercial DNA. So our chief architect founded a company called Hot Jobs, which was the first online job board. And he tells some really funny stories about getting kicked out of investors' offices all through the 1990s with the investors saying, son, nobody's ever gonna get a job on the internet. So, but the company had commercial DNA from the beginning. And so that's made it a lot easier to make that push. So one is going after bigger markets. Two is, I think we need those skills in order to even optimize, make the most of our opportunity on the Fed side. And then third, it gets back to this convergent point. I think it's harder and harder actually to draw a line between federal and commercial. I think enterprise applies to federal and commercial because the architectures are looking more and more similar. The 21st century cloud architectures are not just companies like Uber and Pinterest and Facebook, but the intelligence community, kind of the core of the government, the last piece of the government you would expect to be open from a technology standpoint. Just signed a big deal with Amazon Web Services to move a bunch of stuff to the cloud. So everybody's moving to the cloud, the architectures look the same, and the threats look the same. Again, Iran is attacking not only the Defense Department, but also Bank of America. North Korea, if we believe the attribution, is attacking not only the Department of Energy, but also Sony. So if the architectures look the same, and the threats look the same, then shouldn't the solutions also look the same? Yes?
What was the most valuable skill you learned when you were here?
It was the most valuable skill I learned when I was here. Well, the man who taught me that skill is in the room. I think taking English with Dr. Fitzpatrick and learning how to write and express ideas was the most valuable thing I've ever learned.
Thank you.
So, in terms of kind of, you know, a tangible skill that I use every single day and that I could not do my job without. I think, you know, more broadly, a values-based education and having some sort of a moral and ethical compass is essential. So, you know, in the security world too, with the capabilities that you have come great responsibility. You got to use them the right way, and too many people lose their way. So I think having that kind of ethical, values-based grounding is essential. And a place like Loyola does that very, very well. Yes?
You had a fascinating educational and professional career and experience. And what things from that would you recommend to the guys here in the room?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stands out.
Look, I'm a proponent of a liberal arts education. I just am, you know. Mrs. Mathias managed to get me into a liberal arts college, which was something I've always been grateful for. And I think that, I think the liberal arts are kind of taking it on the chin for all the wrong reasons. I mean, look, if I was a Marine and I run a technology company, I'm standing here telling you the liberal arts are the way to go. So I'm a big fan of a liberal arts education. I think the old adage of not teaching you stuff but teaching you how to think is really important. Again, it gets to the point of adaptability and not being able to predict what's going to be important 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. So having the ability to access knowledge and the ability to have some mental framework that you can hang knowledge on is really important. So I would start with that. And then, my first job out of college was in the military, and the one thing that, one overarching thing that I learned from that experience was just leadership. I mean, there just aren't a lot of places in American life today where young people get real responsibility. There just aren't. It's relatively common to go apprentice yourself to somebody else to learn something. It's relatively common to continue your studies or consult in some form. There just aren't a lot of places for a 22 or 23 or 24-year-old to actually have decision-making authority and have to live with the consequences of those decisions, good and bad. And I had the great fortune of working for a wonderful leader in the Marines who, I'll never forget it. A bunch of us went up to him one day and we asked him, said, what is it about you that makes us so willing to follow you the way we do? Because we follow you to do some truly ridiculous things and we don't think twice about it. Why is that? And he was funny. He thought for a minute and he looked at us and he said, officers eat last. And what that meant for him was that being in a position of leadership wasn't about privilege, it was about responsibility. And he was the guy who woke up earlier, who went to bed later, who carried more weight, who drank less water. And he did all of that not in spite of, he did that because he was the leader, right? He was always deferring to the people who he was responsible for. And I thought that was a great lesson. Yes?
Some of these young men are from freshman year to senior year looking at internships. Just from your own perspective, they might be mutually exclusive, but for them, when they're looking at internships, should they be looking at bigger companies to learn from a bigger company the breadth and scope, or should they go with a leaner, hungrier company where they can maybe contribute more, just from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. If you're looking at internships, should you go to a big company or a small company? And I think there are great opportunities to be had at both. And the question that I would put at the top of my list, if I were in your shoes trying to identify internships, It's not what brand am I associating with. It's not what are my daily responsibilities going to be. It's not will you pay me. It's who will I work for. Individually, what person will I work for? In my view, that matters more than anything else. You can go work at a big fancy name company, but if nobody cares that you're there and they don't think about you on a day in and day out basis, then you're not going to learn anything. And you can go work at a tiny little startup that doesn't have any credibility or any reputation or whatever, but if you're working for a great person, you're going to learn a ton. So the first question I would ask is, who will I work for? And that actually extends, in my opinion, through the rest of your career. The single most important choice that you can make anytime you're changing jobs, in my view, is who's your boss going to be? Think about not just your boss hiring you, but every time you change jobs, you're hiring your boss. Yes?
What do you think is the biggest motivation among hackers right now?
What is the biggest motivation among hackers right now?
Financial or political?
Sure, yeah. I don't know how to rank them, but certainly financial is high. Let's run through a few of the different motivations. One is obviously financial, right? And every now and then they score, a massive hit. More commonly, though, they're able to just skim a little bit from a lot of people in a way that you may not even notice. And actually, for anybody here who does any amount of online banking, I can virtually promise that the Russian mob has stolen money from you. Virtually promise it. And your bank is making you whole. So they're detecting the leakage of pennies out of your account, and they're plussing it up so that you don't know that it happened, because they don't want you to lose confidence in online banking. And it's a better business for them to pay the losses and keep you as a customer than it is to lose you and 300 million other people like you. So we're all losing money to the Eastern European criminal syndicates and the Russian mob and others, and our banks are making us whole. And as long as they're making us whole, frankly, from a consumer perspective, I'm okay with that. I can live with that. Actually, I'll focus my attention on other things. So financial's one, political's one, sure. Especially in places that are more, authoritarian. There's some die-hard, hardcore, government-affiliated hacking groups in China, in North Korea, in Israel, in the United States. Let's not forget that. We give as good as we get, maybe better. So political's one. I think it's kind of like the love of the game, the challenge. The personal challenge is huge. This is a place where a really smart kid working from his parents' basement in Romania can put a headline on the New York Times. It's kind of so there's ego and excitement as a motivation for sure. It's right. The whole field is ripe with opportunity for good and bad. Yes.
When you look at large companies, corporate spending, when they're spending money on cybersecurity and everything, are they trying to solve a problem, or are they trying to check off a box?
Yeah.
For liability?
For most, I would argue, every company's different, right? But I think that for most companies, it's still a compliance exercise. Check the box, satisfy the lawyers, satisfy the audit committee on our board, make the regulators go away. And that's changing. That's changing. I mean, every big breach changes that a little bit. I met with two of our customers yesterday. One film studio, not Sony, and one bank. And these guys get it. They get it. The big financial institutions, the big entertainment industry companies, the big technology companies that are custodians of tons of our data, they get it, and they know that first of all, the financial losses are staggering, and second, the consumer customer confidence issue is existential for them. So the movie industry is actually really interesting because one of the real challenges with cybersecurity is, from a company standpoint, it's hard to tell how much you should spend because it's hard to quantify the opportunity cost, right? I could spend $100 million this year on cybersecurity, or what? Like, what's the or if? The CEO or CFO likes to know the or what, right? And the movie industry is interesting because it's essentially it's a big data predictive analytics industry where they've released so many films for so long that they can model out what their opening weekend revenues are going to be with incredible precision. And every now and then something flops or something hits and they get it wrong, but basically they're always right. And because they're always right, if a movie is hacked, posed in production and is pirated and downloaded online, they can see what the delta was between their model and their actual revenues. And so they can quantify the cost of the hack with great precision, which is valuable as a baseline because it basically tells you how much you should spend.
To me, that's just a loss for the movie industry. When you start getting into things like the target and even market creation, is there the government side also? Are there going to be draconian fines that they're going to?
Yeah, for companies that fail to, by whatever standard, protect customer data reasonably, for that sort of thing. Yeah, I think so. I think so, and I think Target was a watershed moment. I mean, don't underestimate it. We'll look back on that as one of the inflection points in how this all evolved. For the first time ever, a public company CEO got sacked by a board for a data breach. And I guarantee you, his head was spinning. He was completely shocked by that. Because up until that very moment, this was the information security officer's problem. The CEO could say, that's his problem, 3 floors down, 2 hallways over, the guy with the video games in his room. That's his problem, not my problem. And the board said, no, it's your problem. Goodbye. So I think it's a watershed. Yes.
How does kind of your industry, how do you personally view, for lack of better words, like kind of cyber vigilantes, kind of anonymous, things like that?
Yeah.
Where do they fit into the puzzle? Because it's like they're using their evil powers for kind of good.
Right.
Become arbiters.
Yeah, it's really funny. So a couple of things for me. First of all, I actually think the word hacker has a pejorative connotation in our society that we ought to get rid of. Actually, we should get rid of it. Because we need the white hat hackers, like we need good hackers. And being a hacker should not be something that your mother is embarrassed about. Like, we gotta change the culture has to change and catch up. If you fly to the airport in San Jose, California, look out the window, on one of the ways in, you fly right over the Facebook campus. And in huge letters, like out in the courtyard, 30-foot high letters is the word hack. So the people who are building the social network that I don't know, maybe many of you are users of, that's like their ethos, their mantra is hack, right? So first of all, I think we gotta change that perception. Hackers aren't bad. There are bad hackers and good hackers. So it's not hacking that's bad. But with groups like Anonymous, I think that there's sort of a central truth here, which if you fight the internet, you're going to lose. So don't go up against the internet. I turned down a customer recently, another film studio that had been hacked and had their film pirated and released online. And I met with the CEO, and I said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "I want to go after every single person who downloaded that movie illegally and prosecute them." And I said, not only do I not want to work with you, I don't even want to be in the same room with you because somebody's going to kill you and I don't want to be near you when it happens. So if you take on the internet, you will lose. So that's sort of kind of rule number 1. Rule number 2 in my mind is information wants to be free. It just does. it's getting harder and harder to keep secrets. And this is a massive challenge for governments, right? Where there are legitimate secrets, and for some companies too, where there are legitimate secrets, but it is harder and harder to keep secrets. And so I don't think we have a good way to deal with these groups like Anonymous. We should recognize that if you fight the internet will win. I think we need to recognize that information wants to be free, that Edward Snowden was not the last of these kinds of incidents, that the barriers to entry in the cyber world are so low. You know, they just keep falling. Technically, they fall and they fall and they fall. So the ability to have this kind of impact gets more and more commoditized globally, and companies are just going to have to contend with it. It's not a good answer. It's kind of a bleak answer. I'm not optimistic that we can contain. Yes?
So I'm interested in the tension you described between your Silicon Valley and your Fort Meade offices and the comments you made about corporate DNA being in information companies. Does that tell these boys something about the best initial training ground? Is it better to go to private side to sort of get exposed to this? Lots of opportunities locally that are more government-centric.
So it's a good question. So if you're interested in cyber in particular, where should you get your early training? There's not an easy answer. I would say that for most early stage companies, the government is just a terrible customer. Just a terrible customer. Long sales cycles, lots of bureaucracy, opaque, too many backslaps and handshakes. It's not clear how things get done. But the government is the cutting edge early adopter of these technologies. Absolutely, hands down, unequivocally. So if you want to build satellites, or you want to build robots, or you want to build cyber software, government training is awesome. If you want to be you want to build the next Instagram, or you want to build the next Snapchat, or you want to build the next social network, or whatever it is, then go to California. So I'd say the consumer world is completely valley-based. The security world is still very much here, and the enterprise world is sort of like straddling between the two. And I think you can get great training in both places. The best engineers we have, I would say, come from the best engineers that we have come from Google and the NSA. I would just sort of, if we had to play a game and I could only hire if I could hire engineers only from two places, it would be Google and the NSA. But they're culturally very different. And getting them to coexist is hard. Yes?
What role do you see information technology having in an academic setting like this, maybe even starting as early as middle school?
Yeah. What role does information technology have in a setting like this, maybe starting as early as middle school? Look, I think it's awesome that you guys are exposed the way you're exposed. I think it's phenomenal that it cuts across the whole student body. It has a competitive aspect to it. It's sort of individual. It's sort of team. I think this is a phenomenal co-curricular thing for you to do. I think getting exposure to it this way is awesome. I wish I'd had that opportunity. You're that much closer to native fluency rather than having to learn a language late in life, which is great later in life. I don't think anything kind of vocational or pre-vocational should come at the expense of a broad-based education. So how do you strike that balance between making sure that that you have a curriculum where English and cybersecurity can coexist and complement one another? I think that's a pretty awesome secret sauce if you can figure that out. Yes?
You talked a little bit earlier about a healthy relationship between the commercial sector and the federal sector. With the globalization of companies nowadays, what direction do you think policy and law is going to take to sort of compensate for that?
Yeah. It's a good question. Maybe let me elaborate a little bit. So what do you mean, or do you have a hypothesis? I do have an answer, but I
I
don't.
guess I'm just asking for, if a breach happens in a company that's a very international company, but the breach happens in the United States, for example, Sony, do you think policy will ever change that it's not just the United States' responsibility to sort of feel like they have to get back at North Korea for doing it? It's more of a global effort?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of that now through kind of conventional alliances. NATO is a good one. NATO last year formally adopted that. So Article 5 of the NATO. So let me rewind 3 steps. After World War II, there arose this alliance in Europe, right? NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, and NATO's mission, kind of NATO's joking mission, was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. So keep the Russians out of Europe, keep the Americans engaged in Europe, and keep the Germans from starting a third war. That was the mission. And so NATO's become kind of the cornerstone of American defense in Europe. And Article 5 of the NATO treaty says that an attack on any one of the member countries will be treated as an attack on all. So mess with one of us and you gotta fight all of us, right? And late last year, NATO amended Article 5 to say that a cyber attack on one will be treated as an attack on all. So there's sort of some of this collective, a little bit of a collective defense approach to cyber. I would expect there to be more of that. Yeah, more of that. At some point, most of the conventional defense treaty organizations that exist around the world, in Asia, in Europe, North America, I think they'll adopt a cyber clause. But from a liability standpoint, I don't know. I don't think anybody cared about Sony because the only people hurt by Sony was Sony. Nobody was hurt by that attack more than the CEO of Sony. And it's fundamentally different from, say, an attack on JP Morgan Chase that hurts the CEO of JP Morgan Chase only to the extent that it hurt the families, 75 million customers and their families. I mean, we all benefited from the Sony attack because we got to watch the movie for free. Right? Yes?
Kind of along that line, do you think that NATO, that's pretty clear-cut laws and everything. Do you think the rest of the world that it's going to be left up for governments to hash out international cybersecurity? Do you think it's just going to be taken over by industry giants like Kaspersky or Symantec who already have a global presence?
That is an operative question, and I think that's one of the things that will play out here over time. If I had to put my chips in one pile or the other, I'd put my chips in the government pile. As powerful as the companies are, at the end of the day, the power of a government is just so many orders of magnitude greater than the power of a company. At the end of the day, the governments have the guns, so and that's a good thing. Actually, I think that having governments lead on the global policy formulation is going to be better than having companies lead. Thank you. Maybe last question. Yes. Sorry?
What were some of your favorite experiences in the Marine Corps?
Favorite experiences in the Marine Corps. I loved the Marine Corps. I had incredibly good fortune in the Marine Corps to get to do a lot of stuff, very, very quickly in my career. So I joined in '99, spent a couple years in the peacetime Marine Corps, and then was in the Marines, obviously, on 9/11, and went to Afghanistan and Pakistan in the fall of 2001. So I was in the very beginning of operations there in the fall of '01 and the spring of '02, and then went to Iraq in the very beginning of the Iraq War in '03, and got to do a whole bunch of other things too. And it was everything I was looking for. It was great. It was I was scuba diving and parachuting and blowing things up, and it was awesome. And I made my closest friends, and I got to take part in things that regardless of politically how I felt about them, it wasn't about that. I got to do things that matter and have an impact on the people around me, and I learned a ton in the process. So I'm not a Marine recruiter, but I've never dissuaded anybody from considering it as an option. I think it can be a great option. Well, listen, thanks. It's always a real pleasure to be back at Loyola, and I love what you guys are doing. Thank you.